Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Presenting the Medieval World, the 34th Spring Lecture Series hosted by UNM's Institute for Medieval Studies. My name is Tim Graham, and I'm director of the Institute. It's wonderful to see so many of you out there in the audience, and I hope you'll keep coming back. Over the next 4 days, we're going to be hearing a set of presentations that will reveal to us the riches of medieval culture as demonstrated by collections of artworks and documents that have been assembled, transmitted across the centuries, displayed to the public in some of the world's most celebrated museums and libraries, and analyzed by scholars who have revealed their significance and their meaning. It's going to be a wonderful set of presentations, and we will be seeing some stunning slides over the next several days. As you may have noticed, the UNM bookstore is offering a book display in the passageway on the south side of the auditorium. The display includes books by our presenters and on the topics of the presentations. The book display will stay open this evening until a little after tonight's lecture ends. On the next 2 days, it will open before the 5:15 lecture. It will stay open during the break between the lectures, but then will close shortly after the 7:15 lecture begins. On the last day, Thursday, again, it will open before the 5:15 session, and it's going to stay open all the way through to the end of our closing lecture. Please do take an opportunity to browse the display and think about purchasing any items that might be of interest to you. At this point, could I please remind you all to turn off your cell phones? So we would not be able to offer this event without considerable financial support from a broad range of sources. I would like to acknowledge the support we've received once again from the New Mexico Humanities Council and to pay tribute to the support and assistance I've received from NMHC's Executive Director, Dr. Brandon Johnson, Senior Program Officer, Michelle Quisenberry, staff members Jody Hederig and Lucy Silver, and the members of the NMHC board, and particularly their current chair, Dr. Jerry Brown. While thinking of the Humanities Council, could I ask you all please to take a moment at the end of this evening's lecture to fill out the NMHC evaluation form you should have been given when you were given your program as you came in. Those completed evaluation forms are of great assistance to us when we apply for our next grant. We always submit a sampling of them so that NMHC can see that the event has been enjoyed and appreciated. I also thank our donors, the Friends of Medieval Studies, who year after year, through their generous support, have made it possible for us to continue to offer this annual lecture series now in its 34th year. And I thank the 15 units within UNM that are supporting this year's series. The Office of the Vice President for Research, the Office of the Provost, the Office of the Vice President for Student Affairs, the College of Arts and Sciences, the International Studies Institute and its European Studies Program, the Religious Studies Program, the Medieval Studies Student Association, and the departments of Art, Earth and Planetary Sciences, English, History, Linguistics, Music, and Physics and Astronomy. Over the 17 years that I've been director of the Institute, the Office of the Vice President for Research has always shown incredible interest in our programs and have backed us up in every way possible, including through their financial contributions. It's therefore a great pleasure and an honor for me to ask Patricia Henning, Associate Vice President for Research, to introduce this evening's speaker.
I would also like to add my welcome to everyone this evening, coming for the first night of this Medieval Spring Lecture Series, presenting the medieval world. The Office of the Vice President for Research is once again delighted to be able to help support this outstanding event. It's very much an honor to welcome tonight's speaker, Barbara Drake Boehm, who has made a career out of presenting the medieval world to the public. A graduate of Wellesley College, Dr. Boehm received her master's and PhD from New York University's Institute of Fine Arts and joined the staff of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1983. Rising through the ranks, she was assigned to the Met's Cloisters collection in 2008 and was appointed senior curator of the Cloisters in 2015. First opened in 1938, it marked its 80th anniversary last year. The Cloisters houses America's richest, largest, and most celebrated collection of medieval artifacts. It's also perhaps the country's most beautiful museum. It includes a stunning set of gardens that feature plants grown during the Middle Ages. And its buildings are constructed from the cloisters of French and Catalan monasteries that were transported across the Atlantic and reconstructed in Upper Manhattan overlooking the Hudson River. Throughout her career, Dr. Boehm's goal has always been to bring the riches of medieval culture to the public in a broader and more accessible way. For example, by reintroducing special exhibitions at the Cloisters, and by offering Spanish language programming for Manhattan's sizable Hispanic population. Her exhibitions at both the Metropolitan Museum and the Cloisters have received international acclaim. Her The Game of Kings, medieval ivory chessmen from the Isle of Lewis, brought the world's most famous set of chess pieces from the British Museum to the Cloisters. Search for the Unicorn, which she curated in 2013, marked the Cloisters' 75th anniversary and focused on its most famous items, the amazing set of late medieval tapestries depicting the hunt of a unicorn. Dr. Boehm was the co-curator of Every People Under Heaven, Jerusalem 1000 to 1400, held at the Metropolitan Museum 2 years ago, demonstrating Jerusalem's key role as a cosmopolitan center and its influence over medieval people from Iceland to India. The exhibition received many accolades and a huge number of visitors. Dr. Boehm is a prolific scholar, often writing on subjects connected with her exhibitions, and she has received numerous honors and awards for her work. It is a true privilege to have her here at UNM to open this year's Medieval Spring Lecture Series. The title of her presentation this evening is Towering Presence, the Role of the Cloisters. Welcome, Dr. Boehm.
So it's a special privilege for me to be here with all of you and to be introduced both by Tim and by a fellow Wellesley alumna. That's always a special thing for us. Can you all hear me? Yes, good. Could I have a quick show of hands if you've ever visited the Cloisters? Oh my gosh, that's pretty great. Okay, may I have a second show of hands if you've visited the Cloisters more than once in your lifetime? Okay, so I'm not sure that I'm going to have anything to say to you all tonight that you don't already know, but I hope that in any event you're sort of fans and you'll just indulge me while I speak about the place that I'm a privilege to work. Today, I and my fellow speakers spent the afternoon with Barbara Wittemeyer, whom I really want to thank for introducing us to Acoma, a really extraordinary place. And I came to realize very quickly that those of you who live in New Mexico don't find anything surprising about the notion that if you build something atop a high point, that place will have a kind of special magic. That's very much true at Acoma, and I believe it's true of the Cloisters. The Cloisters, as you know, as this group knows, stands really as a beacon in northern Manhattan, and its tower is visible to travelers from afar. It was first opened at its present location to the public in 1938, and as you know, it houses the largest collection of European medieval art in the United States and the most encyclopedic in the world. It occupies really a unique place in the history of the Met, but I would also say in terms of museums in the US and indeed in the world. So I want to talk with you a little bit about what I see in that regard, and starting by showing you a drawing that belongs to the Met that was done soon after it opened by Marsden Hartley. This was done in 1940. He visited the Cloisters on that occasion with Isabelle Lachaise, who was the widow of the sculptor Gaston Lachaise. And he also has, in his letters, there's a mention of a piece that they saw at that time, which I'll show you after a little while, a Spanish crucifix. I chose this image for a couple of reasons. One is because it really gets to the dominance of the Cloisters on this promontory, the highest spot in Manhattan. And interestingly enough, this particular drawing lived between 1964 and 1988 in a private collection in New Mexico. Opposite it is a more mundane image of the Cloisters from an old postcard that goes a certain distance also to suggesting it's a special place and to something of the interior. And I love the way that it calls the room where the unicorn tapestries are exhibited the Hall of the Unicorns, which we've adopted. I couldn't resist not using that terminology ourselves. What do I have to point at?
It was switched off.
I'm kind of like this with a television at my house, and I often need my children, so thank you, Tim, for subbing for my sons. The Cloisters fundamentally is actually a confection. It's put together, it's an assemblage of elements predominantly from France, from 4 cloisters. It's the guillotined leftovers of the French Revolution, in fact. It has the most in common with my second favorite museum, the Musée de Cluny in Paris. Musée de Cluny in Paris is an actual medieval building. The fundaments of it, of course, are Roman, and then it was the townhouse of the abbots of Cluny, you know, when they came to Paris for fun, that was begun in 1354 and then rebuilt in the late 15th century. So actually the time when our unicorn tapestries and their unicorn tapestries were woven. Their museum, the Musée de Cluny, became a public museum in 1843, so more or less a century before the Cloisters. But both of these museums depend very much on the French Revolution. In that, sculpture was from monasteries became secularized. The sculpture was left over, and really very often the sculptures became masons' yards for the people of the time. And when you travel in this part of France, you often see bits of sculpture that even come from some of the same monuments as the Cloisters installed over people's doorways, in people's homes, and so on. So the cloisters itself incorporates four principal, or parts of four principal cloisters. The cloister of Couches, which you had just seen on the screen, the one from Saint-Guillaume-le-Désert, which is near Montpellier, but only as the crow flies, from Tryon, and one which is called the Bonnefont or Bonnefont cloister, but which in fact has not one single stone from the Abbey of Bonnefont. Often, when you deal with early provenances, you discover that dealers made things up to kind of obfuscate where things were really from. But what we can say is that the so-called Bonnefont cloister incorporates elements from mendicant cloisters of the early Gothic period. You'll see in the image there, which is a drawing that was done for approval by the Metz Building Committee before the cloisters was moved to its actual site, and created in its actual site, that there's a standing figure of a monk, specifically a Franciscan, because he's in brown. You have the sense that they're already thinking about ways to bring this museum back to life. What do you do with this leftover sculpture that's been kicking around? How do you breathe life into it? And you get that sense from this image, which I find this kind of odd romance of animating the Middle Ages surprising at a time which was also rather intensely anti-Catholic in the United States. And it's an interesting thing to see that happening simultaneously. There was, in fact, a kind of Cloisters Fever. Have I lost my sound again? You can hear me? In the United States. And I just show you by way of example the museum in Philadelphia with its cloister, which was purchased in 1928. Annoyingly, they have our Couches fountain at the middle of their cloister, and we have their fountain from Saint-Genis-des-Fontaines at our cloister. Somehow they got mixed up along the way, and it's never been righted. And on the right-hand side, the museum in Toledo, Ohio, which was purchased, this cloister purchased in 1929, and it includes elements from Saint-Pons-de-Thomières and something that's Couches-esque, I might say, and perhaps from Ponto, which is another bit that shows up at the cloisters. But there are parallel developments happening at this time in Detroit, in Dayton, St. Louis, Worcester, Massachusetts, Cleveland, Ohio. This kind of cloister fever, which is hard to really understand fully. So I'm not going to try to do all of those today. I'm only going to talk about the peculiarities that obtain at the cloisters. I will mention that at Toledo still today there's a label in the gallery that really gets at that notion of the medieval period as rather dark and dreary, and the title of the label in the gallery says "The Wages of Sin." We don't go for that look at the cloisters, but it is a kind of persistent notion about the Middle Ages, which I think is terribly unfair. Now, our cloisters depends utterly on George Gray Barnard, an American sculptor born pretty much in the shadow of the area of Penn State in Pennsylvania. And you see him here. He's the surprisingly buff son of a Presbyterian minister who went to France to study sculpture and fell in love with medieval art. And I have to say that when lecturers introduce him to our visitors, they do it in a rather romantic way, talking about how he loved medieval art, and he wanted his students to understand just how clever medieval sculptors were and to understand how they used the chisel to a good effect. And all of that is true, but it is also true that much of his motivation was financial. He is in Paris, he's got a wife now, he's got a family, and he's trying to make a living and stay in France. And so he starts buying up these, as I called them, guillotine bits of sculpture that he was finding in private collections, in people's gardens, in bathhouses. Bathhouses and barnyards were the source of a lot of the sculpture that he was purchasing. And he got it all shipped back to the US before a law protecting those very same sculptures went into effect on the 31st of December of 1913. He got these things out just in the nick of time. So yes, he loved medieval sculpture, but he also was trying to be a businessman. His business acumen was perhaps less good than his sculpture capability, but he bought very well. But there's another aspect that comes into play in his cloisters, because he first brings these things and establishes his own Cloisters Museum. And that is very seldom discussed, and I find it absolutely fascinating. His cloisters, which was located a little bit south of where our cloisters is today, it opened on Christmas Eve in 1914, and you see it here by candlelight. I find this actually is particularly amusing because it is virtually impossible to attend a lecture or a series of lectures on medieval art these days without your lecturer telling you while you look at a slide of a chalice or a reliquary, imagine this under flickering candlelight, right? You always have to hear that. Yeah, we get it. There was no electricity. We get that. It looked different. But once you've heard it, it's really not that clever to know. Anyway, he had the flickering candlelight in his Barnard's cloister, which opened on Christmas Eve, 1914. But not only did it open on that date, it opened for the benefit of widows and orphans of the First World War. He knew sculptors there. He received letters from the wives and the widows telling of what they had endured during the war. And this, I believe, had a profound influence on him that you can see right away in these early images of the Barnard cloisters. So on the left-hand side is a drawing of Barnard's cloisters that was done in 1927, which belongs to the Met. And on the right-hand side, you can see a photograph of it. Just look at these images for a second, and you'll immediately begin to sense what he's up to here. He's kind of creating a memorial shrine, right? So on the left, from the outside view, you have a very high cross and this kind of romantic, almost in ruins kind of space. And on the right-hand side, it's even more blatant. We have right at the front the image of a knight of the Dalhuy family, one of the great masterpieces of our collection still today, in his armor, lying as a funerary effigy. His hands are raised in prayer. He's underneath a cross and beneath the protection of the Virgin Mary. So this connection to the loss of soldiers in the war, I think, is very evident in this image. As you approach the cloisters at that time, there was a sign on a stone wall in amidst the foliage, and it said, "These grounds are dedicated to the dead soldiers of France." And near 190th Street, there was a high stone wall with the entrance, and there you could see crisscrossed flags, the American flag and the tricolore of France. There was an additional sign further along as you came in, and it said, "Gothic Monastery of France, rebuilt with the original stones and stained glass for the benefit of the widows and orphans of French sculptors." Images of the destruction wrought by the First World War were very much in the public eye. I'm showing you a mass that was celebrated for Canadian soldiers in the ruins of Cambrai after the war, and on the right, the interior of Reims in the wake of the First World War. This was something that everybody was aware of. And I'm showing to you now, you know these what are they called? Slide viewers, right? Everybody's grandparents had them. And you stick the thing in and you see it like a stereoscope, right? These were very widespread. This particular card belongs to the Rangersville, Ohio local museum, which it's turned up on the internet. And it says, the world-renowned cathedral at Reims, France, ruined by the Germans. There was this very strong notion that the Americans were aligned with the civilized French against the Hun, right? This was the period when, if any of you had German relatives living in the United States around the First World War, that's when they stopped speaking German. That's when they changed the names of the park to something non-German. In Germantown, Ohio, where I grew up, Schiller Park became something like Freedom Park. We've had that thing in our own day when we couldn't call French fries anymore. There's these kinds of notions of adapting what we have of our culture to suit the political moment. Now, on the reverse of this particular stereoscope, there's a long explanation of the problem of the destruction of it. And if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see that they quote someone called Major General von Ditworth, who said, "It is of no consequence if all the monuments ever created, all the pictures ever painted, and all the buildings ever erected by the great architects of the world were destroyed, if by their destruction we promote Germany's victory over her enemies." The destruction of Reims Cathedral became a lightning rod, and it was huge in the popular imagination. Look at this image on the left. We have the witness of the stones. This one is in French, right? Le témoignage des pierres. And the sacrilegious destroyer in the middle, with the sculptures standing on either side, critiquing him, scolding him for what has happened. And you see that on the left it says, it refers to him as the Hun, as the violator. Well, if you speak French, you know that violer doesn't mean violate, it means rape, right? This is a very strong statement about what the side that the Americans and the French were on in opposition to the Germans. And if you see on the right, those are little bits and pieces picked up at Reims in the ruins by a certain Aunt Hazel Gammon, a volunteer nurse. And they've been subsequently posted on the internet by one of her descendants. She, the volunteer nurse, had picked them up as souvenirs of this irreplaceable piece of artistic heritage that had been destroyed. Damaged, heavily damaged. So in 1924, John D. Rockefeller Jr. began his support for the restoration of Reims Cathedral, 1924. The Met opens its cloisters at Barnard's old site on April 1st, 1926, the collection having been purchased for the Met by John D. Rockefeller Jr. Around this same time, there was something between 1930 and 33, something called a mother's pilgrimage. 6,600 some women who were the mothers of young men who had been killed in France were sent to France at the expense of the American government to visit their sons' graves, and they had two other stops. They went to Paris, their son's cemetery, and Reims Cathedral. Curiously, however, by the time the cloisters opened at its own new venue, 1938, moved north deep into Fort Tryon Park from the place where Barnard had it, the museum has become an aesthetically pleasing backdrop without any of the overtones of the post-World War I years. And we have some letters that talk about it and things from the opening of the cloisters. James Rorimer, who was the curator at the time, wrote to Robert DeForest, who was both a trustee and president of the museum, in 1930. This location has been selected as an appropriate site to be crowned with a museum building because of the commanding outlook which it affords over the Hudson River Valley. Crowned, commanding. Then he writes to George Blumenthal, "It is my belief that it will be one of the most uniquely beautiful and interesting structures in this country." Beautiful. And at the opening of the cloisters, Mayor LaGuardia, Fort Tryon Park, the most beautiful of all our chain of beautiful parks, climaxed by this treasure of art, so beautifully designed, as to make it perhaps the most beautiful spot in the entire city. Not perhaps the most eloquent speaking. And it was referred to as the crowning achievement of the Fort Tryon Park development. All of this is about aesthetics and fresh air, and you can see that in the images here too, right? The image of the cloisters in the middle of the park, great art of the Middle Ages in a garden setting. I don't have time tonight to speak about the gardens of the cloisters, but from the very beginning, they have been absolutely integral to the experience of visiting the cloisters. The only person who takes a different position, as we'll see, is John D. Rockefeller Jr. But first, I want to remind you that these comments are being made in May of 1938. May of 1938, 5 years since the burning of books in Berlin. No hint anymore that culture needs to be protected from the Germans. 2 months after the Anschluss of Austria in March, there is no mention of anything happening overseas, no hint of anti-German sentiment of the World War I era, no sense of gathering clouds in Europe, nothing. What was on the mind of John D. Rockefeller Jr. was something quite different and of the moment, and that was the situation of the American worker. In 1 month from the opening of the cloisters, Congress will pass the Fair Labor Standards Act, June 1938, establishing the 8-hour workday, the right to a minimum wage, the notion that you might get time and a half after 40 hours, the prohibition of child labor. It was what FDR called the most important piece of New Deal legislation since the Social Security Act of '35. Rockefeller, speaking at the cloisters opening, was clearly caught up in this moment. And he said, "In the early days of this country, life was relatively drab and barren. There was no leisure time. Duty laid a heavy hand on life, while beauty, if recognized, was viewed askance. With the changes that time has brought, the wholesome and profitable use of leisure, now so startlingly prevalent, is one of the great problems of the day." What did he mean? Is he talking about what we call work-life balance? Well, yes, in a sense, but from an employer's perspective. 8 hours for what we will. So do you see, this is a pro-labor poster. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. It was the practice of companies to watch over its workers 24/7 in order to ensure the greatest productivity. Now, I'm not talking about those late-night emails that require response, right? No, it's about keeping employees from the demon drink. It's a kind of industrial paternalism. One employer, B.F. Goodrich, denied compensation for disabilities resulting from, quote, the use of alcohol or drugs, immoral practices, or venereal disease, accident, or injury received in a saloon or disreputable resort. The receipt of benefits was dependent on good behavior all day, all night, verified with periodic home inspections. In other words, what happened in Vegas did not stay in Vegas. Employers sought to place leisure under company control. Just think, their notion was that absenteeism would drop. People would not be calling in sick the day after the Super Bowl. So, what was the alternative to the saloon or the disreputable resort? Here's John D. Rockefeller Jr. on that subject. In the solution to the problem of having too much time on your hands, the culture and uplifting value of beauty whether apprehended with eye or ear, is playing an increasingly important part. And then he goes on to list good music, drama, elevating books, great works of art and architecture, parks made available to large numbers. All of these facilities for the wise employment of leisure time. More specifically, he saw the cloisters becoming another stimulating center for the profitable use of leisure. He regarded beauty as one of the great spiritual and inspirational forces of life, having the power to transform that drab duty into radiant living. Those who visit, he said, and this is from his remarks at the cloister's opening, go out to face life with new courage and restored faith because of the peace, the calm, the loveliness they have found here. If the many who thirst for beauty are refreshed and gladdened as they drink deeply from the well of beauty, those who have builded here will not have built in vain. Those who have builded here will not have built in vain. In that last line, he's invoking God, right? He's quoting Psalm 127. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. So he's taking the notion of beauty and the notion of spirit and putting them together, and this is, I think, at the fundament of why he supported the building of the cloisters. Oops. But look how empty it was, right? This is our early Gothic hall. You got some tracery in the far window, 2 sculptures, only one of which we exhibit anymore, and a random chair. That's it. So acquisitions for the cloisters, notwithstanding what Barnard had already assembled in terms of architectural material, acquisitions became essential right from the beginning of the cloisters. And Rockefeller showed that himself because he, at the very beginning, donated the unicorn tapestries from his own collection. Now, it opens in 1938, and pretty soon the United States itself is caught up in the war. So there's a little bit of a hiatus before the cloisters really begins actively acquiring. But they've pretty quickly also followed the example of the unicorn tapestries with the heroes tapestries, which I'm showing you in their pre-cloister state. Now, this is a little bit deceptive. The heroes tapestries come from a series of 9, only 5 of which survive. The heroes are 9 heroes who are supposed to be, this is a great concept, they're supposed to set an example for rulers of what good rulership looks like, right? They had this crazy notion in the Middle Ages that if you were a world leader, you ought to follow the example of the famous leaders of the past, take inspiration from them, and use their good example in following your own. And so there were 3 heroes from Christian tradition, 3 heroes from the Hebrew world, and 3 heroes from the classical world. The first one that was acquired for the cloisters, which I confess I'm not showing you, was King Arthur. And we have 4 others that we have in bits and pieces that were acquired during the war years. And you see the bits and pieces here, first on your left-hand side, in a chateau in Normandy, which is called Martin Vaste, where they were curtains in the salon. You see that window there with the curtains hanging? Those are bits of medieval tapestries among the earliest that survived. There's only one other set that is as early as ours. Those are in Angers. It's around 1400. It's almost unheard of to have tapestries this early. You see them pieced together, or the beginning of, you see them still as curtains on the right-hand screen. And what had to happen in order for these to come to be as they are at the cloisters today was basically a tapestry jigsaw puzzle. And that work was done by Margaret Freeman, a Wellesley alum, by the way, whom you see on the left. She's having she has been working on these tapestries all during the war years with trying to figure out how they get put back together. While James Rorimer was away fighting in the war, he had a huge role as one of the monuments men. But you can see that in this image, which was in, I think, either Life or Time magazine, it's set up as if he's mansplaining to her about the tapestries, right? Which is kind of classic Margaret Freeman, James Rorimer role. And then they hired these women who were emigres in the wake of the Second World War, who came in and stitched them together. And this was absolutely extraordinary. One of the women had a baby, so they actually had a kind of childcare set up in the workrooms of the cloisters where the women were working. And then this was the result, these extraordinary things, right? So this is an early picture. The ones that are over the chest, we actually don't exhibit right now because they were getting too much light, so they're living in conservation for the moment. But you can see Hector of Troy or Alexander the Great. I think it's more likely Hector, though I really wanted it to be Alexander. There on the left, we've just undertaken a restoration of this series of tapestries. They've come off the wall, the first one, Arthur, for the first time since they went up in 1949. So when those tapestries were acquired, they split the room, the Hall of the Unicorns, and now we have Hall of the Unicorns and the heroes in the next room over. So we talked about Barnard's collection. Barnard was a sculptor himself. His predilection was for sculpture, but that was also what was easier to acquire because when the French Revolution happened, most of the goldsmith work, anything that they could get their hands on, was melted down, right, to support the revolution and the war against the rest of Europe. The sculpture was left lying around. The books went very quickly into the municipal libraries in France. So the cloisters, even if Barnard had been so inclined as to broaden his collection of French medieval art, would have struggled to do so because those things were much less available. So there was no treasury and there were no manuscripts. But very quickly, they set about addressing that. And you see the kind of pride of that in this poster, which I think was actually in the subway in New York. Art of the Middle Ages, 200 rare works of art, many never exhibited, in a new treasury. Now, the piece that they're showing is the Antioch Chalice, which was acquired in 1950. So again, we're not far away from the war years. And that will have a big impact on what goes into the cloister's treasury. This is an old view of the cloister's treasury. There's that chair again, right? The random chair that floats around. And you see that we have, what you see there is kind of a mixed bag. Some really nice pieces there and a piece that we've taken off exhibition and hidden in the storeroom. But it tends to be what we acquire early on, tends to be Germanic and more secular for the reasons that I have explained. In other words, that the French things were less readily available just because of the accidents of history, because of history, so that there were things more likely to come from other places in Europe. But the extraordinary thing that happens is that the war, or the aftermath of the war, has a huge impact on what's available on the market and what the cloisters is able to acquire, and the circumstances as well. So these are two of our most amazing pieces. These are the Wild Man Ewers. This is kind of like they come from the treasury of the Teutonic Knights, who was like the upscale, classy version of a college fraternity, right? These were for drinking parties, and these were mentioned in the inventories of the Teutonic Knights in 1526 and 1585, and they're attributed to a goldsmith out of Nuremberg. So they were in Vienna up until 1937, and because of the difficult economic situation at the time, that they sold them, and they went to a dealer, Sammy Rosenberg, in Amsterdam, and then he sold them to a woman who's known as the Baroness Catalina von Panwitz, who was of Jewish ancestry. what I don't know, she sold some of her collection in order to get an exit visa to go to Switzerland. I know that she sold paintings for that. I don't know whether these were part of that sale or how they came to leave her hands, but then they went back. They were restituted to her at the end of the war, and then they were sold through a New York dealer, and we acquired the Cloisters. I wasn't around in 1953, but Met staff do that. It's always we, even if it happened 60 years before, unless you don't like what was happening, then it was they, right? The other absolutely extraordinary thing that happened as a direct result of the war experiences and, in fact, the Cloisters' own staff experience was the acquisition of the Hours of Jean d'Evreux. I would argue the finest manuscript in the Cloisters collection, and I can fight with you about the Belzer of Jean de Berry. What I love about this is this tiny book made for a queen with not an ounce of gold in it, all about the subtlety and the refinement of the drawing. It's absolutely extraordinary. And if you were to hold this book in your hands and you were to open it, you would see that inside the front page it says in pencil R1, I think it's 152. Anyway, R stands for Rothschild, and that was the number that the Nazis assigned to it when they stole it out of the Rothschild bank vault in Paris during the war. You know, one of the ways that works of art actually managed to get back where they belonged at the end of the war was that art historians of great capabilities they really made a Faustian deal, and they worked for the Nazis in inventorying many works of art, and so they have perfect descriptions, perfect attributions. It's blood chilling actually to see it. But the good news in this case is that James Rorimer himself, as one of the people charged with trying to get works of art back where they belonged at the end of the war, found this manuscript at Neuschwanstein. Right, according to his account of it, it had been hidden in a wastebasket. I don't know if somebody thought they were going to come back for it or what, but in any event, it was restituted to the Rothschild family and then offered for sale in the early 1950s. And through the grace of God, the Morgan Library had no money to buy it. And so it was, no, it's fine. And so it was offered to the Met. And the Cloisters had no manuscripts at this time. Well, that's not quite true. There was a kind of cruddy choir book that they used for display for kind of an atmospheric thing. See, that was they. But no manuscripts of any quality until this one was offered. And because Rorimer himself had this experience of this particular one, we bought it. And it's one of the great treasures of the Cloisters. Similarly, the Cloisters was able to acquire this amazing work of art. This is one of 4 such shrines. This one, we didn't get it until 1962, but the reason it was on the market was the same. So this is, there are only 4 translucent enameled shrines of this type. And this one had belonged to the poor clares in Buda, which was founded in the 14th century, and likely this was given by Elizabeth of Hungary to Buda. So although it's a Parisian masterpiece by a goldsmith who was called Jean de Touille, it had left Paris and gone farther afield and ended up in the 19th century and the early 20th century, again in the Rothschild collection, and then ultimately came into a dealer's hand. But my colleague Christine Brennan has recently found its record from World War II, and with its picture and its description, and this one was destined for Goering himself. Goering had impeccable taste. I don't know if there's a wonderful book called Wine and War. I commend it to your attention, and it talks about all that the French did to try to protect French wine from the Nazis, and they did very, very well. When they had to send wine to German soldiers, which they were compelled to do, they put the worst plonk that they could find in the barrels, into the bottles, and slapped good labels on them and sent them off, and nobody knew any better. But they knew perfectly well that they couldn't do that when it came to Hermann Goering, or they would have been caught out. So, I don't know, I digress. Not everything that came into the market in the wake of the Second World War, and restitutions of works of art was precious. And it's surprising to me, and I always have to remind myself of this, because we like to say things like, oh, that couldn't have possibly been something that was confiscated from a Jewish owner, because why would they have had that image on the right of Christ on the donkey, which was pulled through the streets of German towns in the Middle Ages on Palm Sunday? But it did. Right? So it's not something that was particularly valuable. It's just made out of painted wood. I don't particularly like it. Most people love it. It was confiscated from a German Jewish collection and restituted at the end of the war, and then acquired by the Cloisters. Similarly, the box on the left-hand side, which is a jewel box, right? And it has a woman shooting the love arrow at the man, and it has inscriptions talking about, oh, my heart, all of that. And then, of course, it has that swastika motif in the inlay on the front. But, of course, those didn't have that meaning before the Nazi era, right? The swastika was something that was very positive, like a good health kind of wish. Well, that piece, too, had been in a collection, actually, of the Bondys, the Bondy family, and was restituted to Elizabeth Bondy after the war. If World War II had an impact on what was available on the market, so did the Spanish Civil War. This is the sculpture that Marsden Hartley was referring to in the letter that I mentioned at the very beginning of the lecture. An extraordinary work of art, and we don't know where it's from, because the same dealer wrote 4 separate letters to the Met saying what the provenance of this piece was, and every time he gave a different provenance. So we're not really sure, but it's Spanish, let's just say that. And of course, this is the kind of work of art that was leaving churches in the early 1930s, and frankly, may not have been preserved had it not been for the fact that it was taken out of churches. So many things were burned, damaged, or otherwise compromised. Barnard talked in that plaque that I told you about, how there was stained glass at the Cloisters, but really there was virtually nothing. The monumental stained glass that's at the Cloisters came in much, much later, and really as the result of the intrepid, irrepressible, and terrier-like determination of one of my predecessors, Jane Hayward. This extraordinary glass is from a castle chapel in a place called Ebersdorf, which is outside Vienna. There's a golf course there now, but there's still the castle, and that the family that had the castle was, as many people were, in difficult circumstances in the 20s, and so they sold it, and it ended up in the Smithsonian. But the Smithsonian couldn't exhibit it because it's not American, right? So it was in storage in the Smithsonian, and Jane Hayward very cleverly negotiated its purchase for the Cloisters, so that the Cloisters has, as almost no other place, stained glass actually in the windows of the building, so that you get the different effects, not of flickering light, but of the changing of the weather, which is such a crucial aspect of the appreciation of stained glass. There were silver stain, these wonderful silver stain roundels. The one you see on the left was acquired in the 1930s. These were used in people's houses, right? So sometimes the subjects are secular, sometimes they're religious. The one on the right was acquired in the 1980s. Does anybody know what it represents? It's a kind of past the orange of its day. It's I don't even know. These are sort of parlor games, outdoor parlor games. They were flirtatious, right? So in this one, the woman was supposed to sit down and put her leg up, her foot up, and the guy would come along and push against her foot in an effort to knock her over, and you could see up her skirts, and it would be very dramatic. And that's this kind of idea of fun in the Middle Ages. So if works of art like this animate our collection, so of course do special exhibitions that we have. So it's very important that the museum changes and grows, right? It's never just the old stones. It has to remain vibrant. And the acquisitions go a long way to do that, and so do our exhibitions. Now, they existed right from the very beginning. This one was in 1943, and it was called Saints and Soldiers. So it's an echo of the whole notion that we saw in the original Barnard cloister, where the image of the knight was being celebrated. This is images of St. Michael and St. George, the kind of exaltation of the soldier, the ennobling of the bloody, right, in a very sanitized kind of way. Many years later, there was an extremely important exhibition at the Cloisters, which I think was very underappreciated by the public for a very obvious reason. And that is the title of the exhibition. The Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis in the time of Abbot Suger, parentheses, 1122 to 1151. Oh, everybody knows what that is, right? Okay, this is an exhibition of extraordinary works of art, but the title is just for, me and my friends, right? It's a complete disregard for what one can reasonably expect anyone to know. And it was a shame, because also, even if you had managed to get to the Cloisters, would you want to walk in that room? Right? Look how it's so kind of intimidating. And it's a shame, because what was in that room was absolutely extraordinary. These amazing works of art. The one on the left is the chalice of Suger himself, which belongs to the National Gallery in Washington. Well, belongs, despite the fact that it was famously stolen from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris in some decades before it was acquired in Washington. And these amazing rock crystal and hard stone carvings from the Byzantine world that then were appropriated by the French. And they're just delicious works of art, but you could never expect people to really realize that. Curiously, an exhibition that was the most sort of sensitive to what the public might respond to was done by my colleague, who is probably the least public person I've known at the Met, Tim Husband, who's really an extraordinary curator. This was done in 1980. It was the concept of the wild man, the concept of this, these wild people who live in the forest and who do all those naughty things that we shouldn't do, right? It was really an amazing exhibition with works of art in a wide range of media that really brought the Middle Ages to life. But with 24 lenders to the Cloisters, this small museum, it really stretched the limits of what the institution was capable of. And as a result, immediately after, we were put under interdict, and there were no exhibitions allowed at the Cloisters until the Game of Kings in 2011. And that was something that I could manage very easily by making the point to the director that it's all one lender. They're all very small. It's going to be just fine. So exhibitions are a way we attract visitors. The buzzword now in the museum world is the visitor experience. We even call it at the Met VX, right? How do we bring the visitors in, and how do we get them to come back? We've always had important visitors, whether it's the Queen Mother on your left or Jerry Garcia on your right. But how do you get people to keep coming? So there were different ways that's been approached in different ways over time. In 1954, there was the medieval festival that featured this dragon. The following year, in 1955, we had Hit the Ring, Get the Ring Over the Unicorn's Horn. In 1952, it's kind of hard to see what's going on here. It looks like there might be a Punch and Judy show at the middle. But if you look at the ramparts over on the left, you see that kind of black blob there? Well, that is a bear who was obviously heavily drugged so that children could ride on him. Yeah, we don't do these things now, right? The museum field does change a little bit. I like to think we make progress. But what we did do not so long ago was to have chess matches, right? And it's so perfect because look at this couple looking at each other in such a romantic way. It's exactly like, they were an ivory mirror back of the 14th century. So this resonance with the Middle Ages, this notion that they're really not so different from us, these people long ago, is, and chess itself, the way we play it today is the heritage of the Middle Ages. The fact that there's a queen on the board and not the vizier is a medieval notion. The fact that there's a bishop as opposed to an elephant, it's all coming out of the Middle Ages. So, but it's hard for us to find the balance between being a museum and not a shrine, right? This notion that Barnard had, that you had to have those flickering candlelights. And sometimes, while that's difficult for us to balance, I think our public wrestles with it too. Look at this. This is the Janet Cardiff exhibition in 2013, I think. People were lying down in the middle of the Fuentedeuña apse whilst the Janet Cardiff, there was music of Thomas Tallis coming out of different speakers, right? And these people would lie down, but people were crying, lying down. They would never do that in a different context, but it was, in my opinion, it was okay because it was contemporary art. So it wasn't a religious experience, it was contemporary art. They were experiencing contemporary art. But what does that look like to me? It looks exactly like people at the Holy Sepulchre, right? And I'm sorry for stealing the Alamy stock photo, but this was the best one, right? Where people come in and there's a kind of religious experience. Well, remember that image at the beginning of the Saint-Guillaume cloister with the Franciscan brother in the brown? And look at this. This is Father Xavier Soibert, at the virtual reality experience that I confess I allowed to happen during our Small Wonders exhibition. I was initially completely opposed to this. Now there you see there's a kind of resonance. He is a Franciscan, though he's wearing his street gear and it's black, not brown in this picture. So my colleagues in Toronto had set up this VR experience so that you could go inside virtually one of these miniature carved beads and sort of wander around through the scene of the Last Judgment. And I thought, this is way too hokey for me. We're not going to do this. And besides which, it was going to cost a couple $1,000s that I didn't have. Then I was told that some nuns attended the exhibition in Toronto and said that it was the most spiritual experience they'd had in years. And the people who planned it said, we'll do it for you at no cost. And at that point I said, okay, let's give it a shot, right? But this question of how do we balance those things? How do we not be a shrine? How do we ensure that what we're doing is enhancing people's experience of works of art? So we don't do dancing bears, but we do we did a honey tasting once. This again, it's this notion of honey as an elixir. Who was telling me last night at dinner that that's why Prince Philip is still alive at 90-something? This medieval notion that, there are certain things you can do, whether it's kale or it's honey or whatever, that can promote longevity. So we had a honey tasting, and we talked with people about how that that notion and the cultivation of honey really is something that we owe to the Middle Ages. And we've done the same thing with cheeses and with wines and with Oktoberfest. And this is the kind of result that we can get in those circumstances. This was from a jazz concert. Does this go along with Rockefeller's notion of the profitable use of leisure? I don't know, but I have that in my mind. What about our collection? What do we do with that? It's essential to me that our installations stay nimble and that we have an expanding ever-expanding understanding of what medieval Europe was. I love to say Marco Polo was the rule, not the exception, right? We totally underestimate how much travel there was, how much exchange there was. And so I was thrilled when about 2 years ago we were able to buy this belt for the Cloisters collection with imagery, and you can see on the left this guy sitting kind of cross-legged who looks kind of Persian. Well, we think it's Genoese. Genoa had colonies in the Black Sea and connections with Persian merchants, and we think that that's what they were celebrating in designing a belt like this. And besides which, we know that merchants of luxury belts, were from Genoa, trading in Paris, trading in Acre, traveling to Egypt, all really across the face of Europe and east beyond the Mediterranean. It's very important that despite our kind of monk-like appearance, that we get to the notion that Europe was not a monolithic Christian society. And that, when it comes to Jewish artistic heritage, is particularly difficult because it's even less frequent, it's so often destroyed, and it has been since the 19th century, really from the time of the great museum's founding, so much preserved in museums dedicated uniquely to Jewish heritage. So we started out by borrowing from the Jewish Theological Seminary. This is the Proto-Haggadah, for an unfinished manuscript of the 14th century. And just last year we were able to acquire, and I'm very happy about this, a Spanish Hebrew Bible from the 14th century, which now joins works of art like the Books of Hours of Jean d'Evreux and the Duc de Berry. Really, this notion of a wider Europe was always inherent in our collection. And I'm showing you the camel, which was acquired in 1959 from the church at San Baudilio de Berlanga, a camel. This church was on the frontier between the Christian and the Muslim world of Spain. Nobody ever talked about that on the labels till a couple years ago. I don't know why. I think it's a fascinating aspect. And on the right, from Barnard's own collection, a capital from the palace at Matinat al-Zahra, just outside Cordoba. These capitals not only existed in that Muslim palace, but were then appropriated by Christians at the Reconquest, and some of them are actually built into the face of Conques itself. So really very much a part of the medieval world. Now, some of you have been waiting all evening to see this piece, and I'm sorry that it wasn't part of my discussion. Because it should have been, after all, today is the Feast of the Annunciation, which is celebrated in this event. For those of you who've talked about this piece or heard about it, you know that it's heavy with symbolism. Everything has its meaning in this extraordinary work of art acquired by the Cloisters in 1956. But in the light of this evening's lecture, I'm going to do something audacious and slightly reinterpret the symbolism here. We have visitors at the door, kneeling on the left. Joseph isn't really a carpenter. We know he was a builder. So let's think of that in terms of the Cloisters. He was a tecton. We've got our visitors showing up. And inside the space, the candle has been extinguished, with apologies to George Gray Barnard. The flower in the vase, however, is fresh as the gardens at the Cloisters. And there is this notion, which is fundamental to this image, that an angel can step into any room and imbue it with a higher spirit, imbue it with the feeling of supernatural, creating awe beyond admiration, as Rockefeller would have had it, a search for the unknown aside from worldly understanding. I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
So the way we like to do questions is I'll call on a questioner and let me repeat the question.
Okay.
And,
All right.
Let me see if I can.
We're going to do Q&A. I'd like Layla to ask the first question.
So, yes, we have time for questions. Is this microphone working or not?
We can share this one.
So, our usual procedure, I will call upon a questioner. I'll do my best to repeat the question, and then our speaker will respond. I just want to say as we get this going, that was a wonderful lecture, and as you will gather from it, this week we're going to be learning a good deal about American culture, as well as about medieval European culture, as we learn how museums and libraries were established in late 19th and 20th century America, and how they went about acquiring their wonderful treasures. So there's basically both a medieval and a modern aspect to this year's lectures. So time for questions now. Yeah. So, does the Cloisters have a Spanish cloister among its 4 or 5 cloisters, forget how many? And also, this piece that you ended on, where does this come from, Barbara?
Define Spanish. So, our 4 cloisters come from what is now southern France, but they are so close to the Pyrenees that some would argue that the Cuxa cloister, for example, is quasi-Spanish. Roussillon, exactly, where the wines are very good too. And this piece was painted in Tournai, 1460-ish, and it's from Robert Campin. And it lives in a room specially dedicated to it in the cloisters.
So Professor Strauss does archaeology in that part of the world, which is why he asked the question. What is the name of the artist of this Annunciation, which is called, the whole piece is called the Marode Altarpiece?
Robert Campin. Robert Campin, Campin. No, it's French. 1460.
Yeah, so the question is, the 2 people on the left, are they the donors who paid for the image?
Yes. Yes, I hope you realize I was being facetious at the end, right?
Yes.
In terms of what you were talking about, the visitor experience.
VX.
I grew up in New York. Every Sunday, I would take the train, the subway from Brooklyn to the Cloisters to listen to the Gregorian chants. It was a prime focus of my teenage life growing up in New York. And with friends and some of our artsy friends who loved to be there. And I was there recently, about a year or 2 ago, and they told me there were no more Gregorian chants on Sunday morning, and I was very upset. Like, the guard couldn't really explain why not. Oh, I can.
So our questioner is reminiscing on when she grew up and lived in New York. She used to visit the cloisters regularly on Sunday and was absolutely charmed by the Gregorian chant that would be sung there. She visited more recently. She was kind of disappointed because no more Gregorian chant. How come?
Well, first of all, I should say that the Cloisters has always had a wonderful program of live music that wasn't within the bounds of what I was going to discuss this evening, but those are special concerts. But you're absolutely right, there used to be. And then for since I've been aware of it, it would start at a certain time in the afternoon, which is either, 2 or 3 o'clock, something like that, late in the day. But perhaps when, anyway, one of my predecessors decided it was not, he didn't want it. And I always blamed the fact that he was a Quaker. He didn't, he's a wonderful man, but he, for example, just by way of example, his children were not allowed to have birthday parties because it was sort of too, celebratory. And so he didn't like things like that. And so when he was head of the department, he stopped it. And subsequently, now the problem is that the technology that was used is obsolete and won't work anymore. So it would actually have to be very deliberate about reintroducing it and updating it. And I would be thrilled if you would write a letter suggesting that. But you didn't hear that from me.
Right up towards the back. So the questioner has seen some wonderful tiles of about the date 1100. These particular tiles that she knows were part human, part beast. Does the Cloisters have anything along those lines?
We do have some staff members who are part human, part beast. I'm not sure that's what you meant. 1100 would be, I wish we had that exact thing that you mentioned. We have lots of hybrid beasts in different media, including some in tile work, which is much later, 14th and 15th century. And we have it in stained glass, and we have it in manuscript illumination. It's sort of everywhere you might want to look, so come see, but it's mostly later. And we have actually I don't think we have any. We have one tile like that, maybe on exhibition right now. The tiles that we don't have a lot on show right now.
Could I ask you to say a little bit about the gardens that you didn't have time to go into? Talk about the plants that are in the gardens and how they were chosen and whether they represent what was known to have been grown in the Middle Ages.
I'm stepping out. I'm a terrible gardener, so I'm stepping a little outside my expertise here. But the Cloisters gardens are just amazing. And actually, when I left, they were just starting to pop. The largest garden, the Kusha Cloisters, cheats a little bit. There are things in there that were not known in medieval Europe, but apart from that garden, that's in order to keep it really vibrant for months and months at a time. But the others are only things that were known in the Middle Ages, and it's extraordinary. So for example, many of the plantings are things that are represented in the unicorn tapestries. Then there's the special section on poisonous plants. The kids love that. There are herbs. Every summer, we actually get to take home basil from the garden in great quantities. We have pomegranates, baby pomegranates. We have a couple of grapevines that I insisted that we plant so we can talk about viticulture. As you may have picked up, I'm kind of obsessed on that subject. And we have a little fig and some olives and some oranges. And in the winter, when the Kusha cloister is glassed in, the smell from the flowering oranges is absolutely heady. It's wonderful.
Are there significant donors today who support the Cloisters?
Yes, but we need more. There is Rockefeller has established an endowment for the Cloisters, but that endowment has to support both operations and acquisitions, and over time, although it's very healthy, prices go up, and it's very hard for us to buy. I want any dealer who has the really best thing to call us first, and it's harder and harder for that, to be sure that that'll happen, because other places, some in California, have vast funds too. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there when it comes to acquisitions. Pardon me, Layla, for that dog reference.
He's a vicar's son from Pennsylvania, a young artist in Paris in the early 1900s when most young Americans in Paris were broke with the possible exception of the Spaniards or something.
So the questions about George Gray Barnard, who purchased the cloisters. He himself was an artist. He was the son of somebody who was not particularly rich. Where did he get his money to buy those items that he was able to get in France?
He was always, in need of funds, borrowing money here and there. He did have one patron, and I'm ashamed to tell you that I cannot remember that patron's name right now. If you look up George Gray Barnard on the Met website, that patron gave a George Gray Barnard sculpture to the Met, but I can't, maybe it'll come, maybe that file will come up later, but I can't. He had one patron.
It made extremely expensive because he was dismantling the cloisters, he was storing them, shipping them.
Right, but he, I'm sorry to interrupt you, he worked hand in hand with some of the big dealers in France as well. So that's another indication that we have that, some of this was, that he was financially motivated. Yeah.
I know there's a question at the front. Let me just make sure. Am I missing anybody? Yes, Henry.
Islamic art isn't in the brief of the cloisters, but Islamic art certainly had influences in the Christian art in the Middle Ages, and you didn't show anything or mention that at all.
I did.
So I think everybody heard the question, which is about there being not much Islamic art in the cloisters. Barbara, if you'd like to respond.
I did show.
We lost. There you go.
I did show the capital that I showed at the end from Madinat al-Zahra in Cordoba, right, was the one that I showed. We have an ivory pyx, an exquisite piece that was purchased with Cloisters money in the 1970s, which reflects that influence. We have several carpets, which are Spanish with Islamic influence, and several textiles as well, which are, I just didn't have time to show more. And a couple years ago, getting back to that issue of funding, there was the most amazing rock crystal chess piece, Islamic rock crystal chess piece on the market. Which would have been an amazing acquisition for the Cloisters, because rock crystal pieces like that were taken as booty or sometimes acquired through more legitimate means and ended up in Spanish church treasuries or into the pulpit in Aachen, for example. Would have been a perfect thing. We didn't have enough money for it, and it's in Qatar. We also have an Islamic department, right? So we have to.
So I see a question here, and then there's one toward the front. Yes, Marina.
This is fascinating in every respect. I'm torn because there are two recent exhibitions I want to ask you about. But I think I'm only going to ask you about one. The one I'm not going to ask you about is the Jerusalem exhibition, because I'm very curious about sort of the sensitivities that you had to handle in doing that one. But what I want to ask you about is actually a much more lighthearted one, which is Heavenly Bodies. So I saw it in both places, and when I was at the Cloisters, the moment that I will never forget, and I actually posted on Instagram because it was so amazing, was nuns with cell phones photographing the costumes.
Fantastic.
And then presumably sending the photos to somewhere, I don't know. So can you talk a little bit about the reception of it, and also whether there were sensitivities going into that you were concerned about?
Okay.
What was the title of that exhibition again?
Heavenly Bodies.
Okay.
So the questioner, who happens to live in the New Jersey area, is a frequent visitor to the Cloisters and is asking about one of the recent exhibitions. Its title again? Heavenly Bodies. She was very taken on visiting that exhibition when she saw some nuns taking pictures with cell phones of the exhibits. But Barbara, can you say a little bit about how that exhibition was put together, what the point of it was, and how it was received?
Yeah, thank you. That's a delicious topic for me. I actually think that the most sensitivities that I had to face came from other colleagues at the Met. Some of my colleagues are dismissive of the work of the curators in the Costume Institute. And I think, based on my own experience, that that's terribly wrong and unfair. This was an exhibition that was juxtaposing, putting into the cloisters high fashion designer pieces that were made by designers whose worldview was shaped by Catholicism in one way or another. Most of them grew up in the Catholic tradition, and really they were affected by the pageantry, by the appearance of the clergy and other church officials that they came into contact with growing up. So I thought this was actually a perfect thing for the cloisters, because from the very beginning, the church has used apparel, has used attire, the way people appear to as a means of identification, and as a thing that is discussed, right? And remember how St. Francis, he's the son of a rich merchant, and what is the first thing he does when he changes his ways, when he finds Jesus, is he takes off all his fancy clothes in the middle of the square. So I had no problem with the concept of it, and I thought that the works of art really sang in our space. I thought that they were resonant, and that they appeared in a very deeply respectful way, thanks to my colleagues' work. I will tell you, do I have time to tell an anecdote? Okay, I'll tell you one or two anecdotes about that. So one of the things that was in the exhibition was a silver crown of thorns that was designed for Alexander McQueen. And it was in the Cloisters Treasury as you walked in, and it transformed the Cloisters Treasury into the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. Why? The whole Sainte-Chapelle is built to house the crown of thorns. So I loved the appearance of that. And that was pretty special. Then we had, in the Kusha cloister, we were supposed to have we did have some amazing Valentinos, but then suddenly Andrew introduced these two Rick Owen pieces. And I don't know if you know Rick Owen's work or not, but he's the body designer, right? He's like the Chaucer Canterbury Tales version of the Middle Ages. And this costume, it reminded me of those BVDs that, those onesies for grown-ups that men would put themselves into for the winter, right? So it had a snap trap in the back and the snap trap in the front, and the snap trap in the front was highly visible. And Andrew installed this, and I said, "Are you kidding me? I have volunteers coming to the cloisters who have to take around the group of 10-year-old boys. How are they going? What are they going to say, right? To control the crowd control." And I went away and I thought about it, and Andrew's response was, "Oh, Rick would love the fact that you're struggling with his work." And I went away and I thought about it, and I was reminded of the story of Saint-Guillaume. So of our 4 cloisters, one of them is from Saint-Guillaume-le-Désert. And Saint-Guillaume himself has this fabulous, wonderful legend about how he became a holy man. And he had a very militaristic start to his career, and then he has his come to Jesus moment, and he decides to be a monk, and he joins the monastery, and he just can't quite get it yet, and he ultimately gets kicked out of the monastery because he eats too much and he doesn't behave well at table, and one night he breaks into the wine cellar and drinks all the wine, and he gets kicked out, and he has to try again, and so this sort of struggle of the sort of baser instincts against the holier instincts. And so I said to the volunteers, okay, just remember Saint-Guillaume. Tell the kids about these kinds of themes, and that's how you can explain Rick Owens. The funny part is that the 10-year-old boys never noticed them. I don't know. So. I did.
So I'm going to make this the last question. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, come up and talk to Dr. Boehm when we wrap up. Last question, yeah.
So imagine you have several items that were looted during World War II, recovered in some manner by their owners, and subsequently sold to the cloisters.
Right.
Have you encountered anything that had a irregular chain of custody? And if so, how did you deal with that?
So the question is about items that have ended up in the cloister that were actually loot in World War II. And the question is, have there been chain of custody issues in such acquisitions? And if so, how has the cloisters dealt with that?
It's something we work on all the time, and it's something we work on whenever we're trying to buy something. I'm working very hard right now on a piece that I'm dying to buy, and I'm trying to fill in the blanks in its history, so it's something that we're constantly aware of. Some years ago, we had on loan to us a Sienese reliquary tabernacle. It had a beautiful image of the Virgin and Child in the middle, little relics going around the outside. And it was on loan to us from a man who was a Jewish refugee from Germany, and he lent it to us, and he told his wife he wanted to give it to the Met when he died. He wanted to will it to the Met in recognition of the fact that he was able to make a new home in the United States. So she wanted to honor that subsequent to his death and came to see us. And so then I started doing some work on it. And coincidentally, one of my colleagues was purchasing at auction a 12th century bronze, which came up at auction because it had been restituted to a family from which it had been confiscated, and they then sold it at auction. And when I heard the name of the family, I said, "What? I can't believe it. That's who owned this reliquary." Before the man, are you with me? So the man who lent it to us was a Jewish refugee, but the previous owner was a Jew who had had to sell his collection in order to have enough money to get out of the country. And this was astounding to us. And I went through the files. We actually knew that name because they also had offices in New York, the same family. And we found correspondence from the time of that sale from the family saying, in the 30s, saying, you know, Uncle so-and-so is closing his business in Munich and coming to the States, and if you'd like us to bid for you at the auction on any pieces, we'd be happy to do so. Because, of course, they were hiding the fact that it was a forced sale because they wanted to realize the most that they could from the sales. Completely logical, right? But there was no hint in any of the museum records that there was anything amiss about having that be in the collection history until this subsequent sale of something, and that the heirs had said we should have that. So we then had to go to the woman who was trying to give it to us and say, guess what? This is the history of this piece. It belongs to you, but ethically, we need to inform you what the story is, and you have to make your own decision. So she said, okay, she could have disappeared with this piece. We would have had no control over it. But she did the right thing, and her lawyer then contacted this other family. Her hope had been that the two families, because the other family survived as well, that the two families could donate it. But the second family had so many descendants that they couldn't come to an agreement, so it went to auction. We tried to buy it at auction, and we lost. But the good news is it went home to Siena, so at least it didn't disappear into another museum. At least it went home where it came from. I could live with that, but that's one example. Okay, that's it, right?
So tomorrow at 5:15, please come and join us for a lecture by Holger Klein on the Guelph treasure, the greatest collection of precious objects from medieval Germany, and that collection's fate in more recent times. And at 7:15, a lecture on the Cairo Geniza, the storeroom of the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Old Cairo, which houses the most extensive collection of medieval documents in the world that reveals a huge amount about life in the medieval Middle East. Come back and join us. For this evening, we've been given absolutely privileged insight into the riches of the Cloisters collection from the person who knows that collection better than anybody. Let's give Barbara Boehm a tremendous round of applause. you.